Afternoon, everyone. Yes, my role today for the next 30 minutes or so is to try and increase understanding in pensions, sort of demystify pensions as such, which is a tricky enough feat, particularly when it comes to pensions in Ireland, because I always say we have probably the most complicated pensions landscape there is around. So I'm going to try and keep things as simple as possible. I'm going to talk a lot about the state pension. Because there's been a lot of talk in the news recently about the state pension. And when I talk to people, people do have this shroud of mystery that hangs around what they're entitled to when they come to retirement, what they're entitled to, and indeed when they're entitled to. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk about auto-enrollment, again, something else that has been bandied about in the media. And this is a pension scheme that is going to be introduced by government to encourage additional savings by everyone who's working to provide increased income when they come to retire. So a little bit about that. And I'm going to talk about incentives, because this is something really I find that a lot of people aren't fully aware of. And that's the incentives. Government actually offer really valuable incentives when it comes to saving for our retirement, to incentivize the likes of all of us and to contribute to a pension scheme or pay into a pension plan. So again, that we're not overly reliant on the state pension. And then I'll also just go through basically how the investments work very, very simply, and also what entitlements are available when it comes to retirement. So well-being is a term, a word that's used a lot for obvious reasons these days. I'm going to talk a little bit about financial well-being. And when I think about financial well-being at the moment, I think about the salary that I get every month. Thankfully, I'm lucky enough to get a salary, and it's paying the likes of the mortgage, the rent, all the other bills that are due at the end of the month, and hopefully I have some disposable income left at the end of that. But that's all fine when I'm working and I have that salary. How do I maintain that financial well-being when I actually stop working, I leave the workforce? And that's all to do with pensions. So there is the state pension, as I mentioned, available to everyone. It's based on your PRSI contributions. The maximum state pension entitlement currently is just a little shy of €13,000 per annum. That's about to go up, as anyone who saw the last budget will be aware of, by €5 a week. And just a little bit of issue around the state pension is, when is it entitled to be paid? Previously, it was paid at the age of 65, the contributory state pension. And then after the last financial crisis, it was agreed that it would be deferred out to age 66 from 2014. And then, as myself and Saoirse were just talking beforehand, it's hard to believe that at the beginning of last year, there was actually an election. And really one of the main points around the election was when the further deferment of the state pension age out to 67, which is meant to come into effect with the beginning of this year. So that was postponed, and government actually put in place what's known as the Pensions Commission, basically to examine the sustainability and eligibility of the state pension going forward. And I'm going to go into that a little bit detail in the next slide. So the state pension is there. It's purely designed as a prevention against poverty. And in fact, some people, won't rely on state pension because, as you can see there, 1 in 12 people have no intention of ever retiring. I'm definitely not one of those. I actually have an app on my phone that actually will tell me how long I have to go to retirement. So that's not a good thing. But as I said, it is a prevention against poverty. And depending on the level of earnings you're used to while you're working, it can create an earnings gap. And you can see that on the right-hand side of the screen there. So depending on the level of earnings, you will have a level shortfall if you rely purely on the state pension. And that's the maximum state pension when you come to retirement. So I mentioned this Pensions Commission that was put together by the government, and they're, as I said, they're looking at the sustainability and the eligibility towards the state pension. And this is quite a busy screen, so please, I won't go. I'll just briefly guide you through it and why they're examining this. The first one is the fact that we're living older. It's a sign of medical advances that we're all living longer. Don't know if we're living better, but we're definitely living longer, and therefore the cost of providing a pension for longer is obviously higher than it would be previously. The second one, which is probably one of the most relevant ones, is the state pensions are operated on a pay-as-you-go basis. That means that the likes of our employers and our own PRSI, excuse me, are used to fund the state pensions for those that are currently entitled to them. And that's not too bad at this moment in time. We have about 4 people in working age to each older person. But as you can see, the demographics in Ireland are getting older, and we won't have what the young workforce that has been mentioned previously before going forward. And indeed, in 2051, it's estimated there'll just be a little over 2 workers for every 1 older person within the state. And that means that the pension-related costs will increase. And one of the proposals within this Pensions Commission is an increase in PRSI costs. So keep an eye on anything you hear in the media in relation to the Pensions Commission. It will have an effect on pretty much every one of us if we're lucky enough to reach retirement. You can see there is a deficit in place already within the Social Insurance Fund. And that is going to increase substantially unless actions are taken to increase the contributions into it and to defer the payment of the state pension out further. In addition to this, there's auto-enrollment. So auto-enrollment is designed basically to increase pension coverage within the state. Within the private sector, there's only about 35% of people actually have a pension scheme or access to a pension. And auto-enrollment is designed for those that are not already in a pension scheme and meet a certain minimum standards. Really, the areas that they're looking at targeting in particular are low-wage earners and smaller employers, because that's where you have the lowest coverage when it comes to pension schemes. And there will be an opt-in available for those that are self-employed as well. It's designed to have a phased introduction over 10 years. And that is designed to come into place in 2023, though I have a big question mark over whether that will be able to be put in place. It has been delayed mainly due to the COVID crisis, because the sectors that they are targeting with auto-enrollment are those sectors that have been hit hardest by the COVID crisis. So your retail, your service sectors, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll watch this space keenly to see if it actually is introduced in 2023. But it would be very difficult, along with forthcoming PRSI increases, if the government accepts the recommendations from the Pensions Commission. How will it work? Well, employees aged between 23 and 60, those that are earning over 20,000 euro per annum, who are not already contributing to a pension scheme, they will automatically be enrolled. Those employees will then be free to opt out of the system after each contribution rate increase and during the 7th and 8th month after each increase. So every 3 years there'll be a rate increase, and the 7 or 8 months after that, the individuals will be able to opt out. They will have a choice from a range of retirement savings options, and we at Zurich hope to be part of the choice that's available to employees. And what's it going to cost? Well, the minimum contribution will be increased on a phased basis, as I mentioned. It'll be 1.5% from the system's launch, increasing every 3 years by 1.5%, up to 6% by the beginning of year 10. And those enrolled in the auto-enrollment system in latter years, they'll do so at whatever contribution rate is available at that time. Now, that in itself is a big challenge, because someone comes out of college or university straight into the workforce, and there's a 6% minimum contribution. That's a serious chunk of change to be taken out of a pay packet. So there'll be some challenges there, I would imagine, as well. And in addition to that, employers will have to match those contributions going into the auto-enrollment scheme. The state will provide an incentive, and that incentive is €1 for every €3 saved by the member. And that equates in percentage terms to 25% tax relief. So it's important to note that, because I'm going to go through some of the details in relation to tax relief and the incentives that are currently offered by governments for saving for retirement. So that's auto-enrollment. As I said, it's due to be introduced in 2023, though there's a question mark, as I said, over that. Currently, though, as I mentioned, tax relief is on other taxation incentives are offered by government to incentivize all of us to save for retirement, and not just to rely on the state pension when we leave the workforce. So the most common tax incentive is tax relief. And as you can see there, it's based on the rate of income tax that any individual has. And the tax relief is for any employee contributions. So that's for, if you're an occupational pension scheme, any contributions you have to make into that scheme or additional voluntary contributions. If you're in a PRSA, any contributions you make into the PRSA as well. Or indeed, if you're self-employed and you're in a personal pension, these would apply as well. So you can see how it works. If you're to make a contribution of €125, you would get, €100, you would get €25 tax relief, and that means that 125 would be actually paid into your pension account. And if you're on the marginal rate of tax, similarly, if you paid in €100, you get tax relief 67. That's 167 that would be paid into your pension account. Now, in addition to this, there are two other taxation incentives offered by government that are not well known at all. The second one, after tax relief, is the fact that the monies invested are invested in pension funds, and they are tax-exempt pension funds. So, for instance, when you save money on a bank account, you might be liable to dirt tax. If you save in stocks and shares, you could be liable to capital gains tax. There is no taxation liability in the growth or the investment within pension funds. That means through the power of compounding, you achieve your goals a lot quicker through saving through a pension scheme than you would through any other savings vehicles. In addition to this, when you come to retirement, you can take a significant proportion of the fund that you build up through your pension scheme down as a tax-free lump sum at retirement as well. So those are very valuable incentives, particularly the tax-free growth. As I said, mentioned, through the power of compounding, this really results in optimal outcomes for people invested in pension schemes. And this is a typical example of, say, someone on 48,000 annual salary, and they're paying the marginal rate of tax. And assuming, say, we would see this as a common structure within occupational pension schemes, where an employer is putting in 5% on behalf of the employee every month. That equates to €200 investment. Employee has to match that, so that's another €200 investment from the employee gross. However, the employee is entitled to 40% tax relief, and that is €80 per month on the €200 that they've put in. And that means for a total monthly contribution into a pension scheme of €400, the net cost, the out-of-pocket cost for an employee is only €120. And that in itself, the slide I call the no-brainer. If anyone's a member of occupational pension scheme or has the option to join an occupational pension scheme with similar contribution rates, it really does make a huge amount of sense. If you add that into the fact that you get tax-free growth on your investments, and then with the money that you built up, you can draw down a proportion of it as tax-free cash, it really does make huge sense to invest in a pension scheme. And if you're in, this only applies to those that are in occupational pension schemes, you can boost your income in retirement by making what's known as additional voluntary contributions. And we'd always encourage people to look at this and examine this. And it really is dependent on the disposable income you have available to you. But making additional voluntary contributions, you can attain all of those taxation incentives I mentioned earlier on. So you will get the tax relief on anything you pay in. You will be invested in tax-exempt funds, so you will get that increased power compound interest going forward. And finally, you will be able to draw a significant proportion of the fund down as tax-free cash when you come to retirement. Now, just to note, there are maximum amounts that you can put in, and that is a percentage of your net relevant earnings. And you can see that there are age-related limits. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen, and they're subject to a maximum earning of 115,000. Always, when you're looking to do anything like this, I would seek financial advice. If you're invested in the PRSA, these are just increased employee contributions that you can make within PRSA. And again, those limits apply similarly, those age-related limits as well, and the maximum earnings that are allowable. So I hope I've explained the state pension and the taxation incentives and auto-enrollment as straightforward as possible. One thing that is always a mystery to people that are involved in pensions and pension schemes are investment choice, and what are the investments available. And you tend to hear the really shock stories only. when it comes to pension schemes. And, you know, I lost all my money based in my pension. This rarely happens. I have to tell you, this is where people speculate with their pension funds in either leveraged assets or in you know, one or two stocks or shares or something like that. It's a very rare event for people to lose money on their pension investments. But unfortunately, bad news, you know, is always printed ahead of good news. The investment choices available to anyone that's in a PRSA or an occupational pension scheme is basically there's a default investment option that's pre-selected that's available to you. We would find that probably about 90% of PRSA members or occupational pension scheme members would opt for a default investment option. But then there are those that want to make their own investment decisions, and they can make their own investment decisions based on the funds that are available from the PRSA provider or the occupational pension scheme provider. Now, within those investment choices that are available, there are a number of asset classes. These asset classes are varied. The first one that is probably the most well-known asset class is cash, and that's money on deposit. If you have debt at the moment, cash is the low interest rates are great at the moment because obviously you're paying low interest rates. It's a record low interest rate environment that we're in at this moment in time. However, if you're trying to save, using cash is not optimal because of those low interest rates, but it's a very liquid asset and allows transition from one asset class to another. We also have property. So at Zurich, we have funds that invest in what's known bricks and mortar, commercial property funds. And we also have funds that invest in global equity companies around the world that predominantly themselves invest in property as well. And then you have bonds, which are loans to companies or loans to governments. And finally, which is the most predominant asset class within pension schemes, are equities. And there are investments in individual companies. So your CRHs or your Ryanairs that you would hear on a regular basis. And the reason why equities are the most predominant asset class that pension schemes actually invest in is because over the long term, equities offer the best returns. And investing in a pension scheme is a long-term investment. So they go hand in hand. And all of those asset classes are sort of linked to risk return. So the higher the risk you take, the higher the return you get over the long term. And you can see here in a very simplified graph on the screen, you have cash offering very low risk, as we know, but offering very low returns as well. Then in the middle, you have bonds offering medium risk, but medium returns as well. And at the very top of the scale, offering the highest risk and the highest returns are property and equities. So they're the ones where you would achieve over a long term the best returns from their asset classes. And you hear a lot, and I mentioned about hearing people losing money within their pension schemes, which, as I said, is a very rare case and mainly due to speculation. But you do hear about volatility within the valuation of pension funds. And this happens on a regular basis. It would have happened last year with the onset of the COVID crisis, when we had some of the biggest decreases in investment markets after the onset of the COVID crisis. Yet by the end of the year, certainly the Zurich funds had returned into, many of the Zurich funds have returned into positive territory. So for those that have a long way to go to retirement, don't worry about volatility. We have it there that it should be viewed simply as the cost of good long-term performance and not a risk to be avoided. And good investment strategies tend to reduce returns and volatility, that risk-return scale as you approach retirement, thereby locking in any gains that you may have made in the early years. And this is an example of our personalized guide path. This is our strategy, our default strategy at Zurich. And there's a number of options available as well within the strategy, but we assume with the medium approach, our Prisma 5 fund would have one of the highest exposures to equities within our Prisma range. There's only one higher, which is our Prisma Max. So anyone who has 15 years or more to retirement, we invest them automatically within that Prisma 5 fund. Then, as they come into between 15 and 5 years to go to retirement, we reduce their equity exposure by moving their funds and their contributions gradually into the lower equity exposed Prisma 4 fund. And then based on conversations they have with their financial advisor, they have a range of choices of funds which they can de-risk into. And the lowest risk of those will be a cash fund, if anyone wants to do that. But there's obviously lots of decisions that have to be made throughout the journey towards retirement. The middle blue bubble is one I always highlight as probably being the most important of all. And that's the employee setting their retirement plan in place. So if any of you do have a pension scheme in place or are thinking about setting up a pension scheme in place, remember about 5 years before retirement, engage with a financial advisor to make sure that the funds that you de-risk into in the last final 5 years are most appropriate to your circumstances. And that involves a long conversation about what your plans for retirement are and what access you have to other assets and savings that you may use when you come to retirement. And just to touch on retirement, what does happen? What are the options when you build up, this pot of money through a pension scheme? What is available to you when you actually do decide to leave the workforce? And there are, as I mentioned earlier on, with the funds, you can draw down a proportion of that as a tax-free lump sum. Now, it depends on the pension and vehicle that you're invested in, but generally right across the board, you can take 25% of the value of your fund as a tax-free lump sum up to a maximum of €200,000. Now, with the balance of any balance of the fund that you have invested, you can invest in either a combination or either of an annuity or an approved retirement fund. And an annuity is basically a guaranteed income for life. And annuities are linked to interest rates. So what your financial advisor would do is they go to all the various annuity providers, which are generally the life companies in the marketplace, and try and get the best rate for you at that time. Now, at the moment, annuities are not very popular because, as I mentioned, they are linked to the interest rates, and interest rates, as I mentioned, are at record lows. So therefore, the average, the guaranteed income that you get is quite low compared to your pot of money. So what we see a lot more popular option is investment in improved retirement funds. And that is investing in funds similar to those that I just illustrated there previously within your default strategy. And from those funds, you are required to draw down if you so wish, but the government will want a taxation, their taxation assuming a drawdown of about 4%, which can change depending on your circumstances every year. Approved retirement funds, where annuities give you a guaranteed level of income when you're in retirement. Approved retirement funds give you a flexible income. So you might need to increase funds in your early years of retirement. Maybe you need to provide, a deposit for a child, for a house or something like that. You might want to go traveling. Approved retirement funds are fantastic for that because you are not tied into a certain level of income every year, except the minimum, as I said, that's required to be assumed or drawn down for taxation purposes. Whereas with the annuity, it's guaranteed for as long as you live. So annuities are, and this is the ironic things about annuities offering guaranteed income, they're fantastic if you live long because you get that guaranteed income for as long as you live. But if you don't live long in your retirement, they die with you. And unless you increase the cost of them by making provision for a spouse as well. And you need financial advice. That's why I mentioned that when you have 5 years to go to retirement out, seek financial advice in this area. It is critical because you need to have discussions about the state of your health and life expectancy, your requirement for flexible income, or your requirement for guaranteed income. And it's to sort of throw a blanket on it and just, what retirement actually looks like. Generally, in early years of retirement, people would like flexible income to have a range of options. But as they get older and they maybe get less mobile and health costs might increase, there might be more reliance on guaranteed incomes. And again, a financial advisor would be ideal to point you in the right direction of how to achieve that. You can also, you run the risk of exhausting your fund if you solely invest in an approved retirement fund. So it needs careful management throughout retirement as well. So again, you need to have a conversation with an advisor on that basis. And I mentioned that the annuity passes away if you were to pass away in retirement as well. The approved retirement fund is far more inheritance friendly, shall we say. So again, you want to compare the benefits of both of those options on death. and whether you want to take that into consideration for your own plans. And so just to finish up before we move on to a Q&A, I get a lot of frequently asked questions on pension schemes and members of pension schemes, and the most common ones are, what's the maximum you can contribute? And that's really particularly for people that are older, may have more disposable income. They are those age-related limits that I set out earlier. And it's very important to know that you have maximum overall funds. It's known as the standard fund threshold, which you can achieve at retirement. It's currently €2 million. So you cannot fund for anything over that without incurring serious taxation liabilities. So again, having financial advice is really valuable. Another one I get was the earliest you can retire. Obviously, it is actually possible to retire from the age of 50 with the permission of your employer. The real answer to that is when you can afford it. And you need to take into account, you go back to the very start, the availability of state pension to you. And that's why it's going to be very, very important to look at those recommendations that are made by the Pensions Commission to government and see what recommendations the government actually put in place, because they will affect when all of us decide to actually retire and the amount that we be able to retire on. Another question I get commonly asked is, if you're to pass away in retirement, what happens to your fund? Well, up to 4 times your salary is actually passed as a lump sum to your estate, and anything in excess of that, and there's just been some recent legislative changes in the finance bill, can be used to invest in either annuity for your dependents or now an approved retirement fund as well. So it's a little bit more inheritance friendly following the recent finance bill than it was beforehand. So they're the common questions that we get when it comes to retirement. That's me done. I think just a half an hour, Saoirse, today. I always say to Saoirse, if we talk about pensions for any longer than half an hour, people tend to go off to their happy place. I hope I've helped in demystifying pensions somewhat for you all. And as I said, it's a very, very complicated area. Always seek financial advice when either you're starting a pension scheme or you're approaching retirement in particular. It's very important that you do that. So thank you for your time this afternoon.